Welcome to the Young Leaders Institute 2020 Youth Conference, a virtual meetup and national conversation about the issues affecting young people across the country. For those of you who are new to us, the Young Leaders Institute is a youth leadership platform that equips young people with leadership skills in the areas of interpersonal skills, development, conflict resolution, character education, ethical leadership, and civics. YLI also offers year-round mentorships and internships to high school students and to college students across various disciplines and leadership roles. Today, we bring you a discussion about the systemic and economic aspects of racism, the recent executive order on policing, policies that make possible the dehumanization of Black and Brown people, and how we can support the Black Lives Matter movement as not only as protesters, but as constituents. Today is the part 2 of last week's discussion, which took place on Juneteenth, which is also known as Freedom Day, a great day of historical commitment to the African American community. It was an amazing discussion that focused on the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement and its importance within a social, cultural, and historical context. The full webinar can be viewed on YouTube, Facebook, and via the YLI website. My name is Chidima, and I'd like to welcome all of our viewers from across the country and around the world who are live streaming with us on Facebook. I'm 18 years old and a recent graduate of Eleanor Roosevelt High School. I'll be attending Vanderbilt University in the fall. I'm relatively new to the YLI family, and I've come to learn of the amazing work they're doing to uplift youth voices, developing leadership skills, and encouraging young people across the world to stay engaged in social justice movements that are changing our world. It gives me great pleasure to serve as your moderator for this discussion. We will be taking questions at the end of our discussion, so you may drop them in the chat box anytime during the discussion. With us today, we have federal policy advocate Sahel Khan, civil rights attorney Andre Massa, and senior policy analyst for the Justice Action Network, Lauren Krasai. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to begin by asking each of you to take a minute or so to introduce yourselves and tell us about your line of work and what enables you to fight against racial inequality. So we will start with whoever wants to go first.
I go first. I volunteer. All right. My name is Andre Mahassa. I currently have my own practice, my law practice. I've been an attorney. It will be 20 years in December. I was born and raised in Baltimore City. Obviously, Baltimore City over the last few years, we've had our share of news issues concerning brutality and civil rights issues in Baltimore the last few years, but I was born and raised in Baltimore. I'm a graduate of the University of Maryland with a Bachelor's of Arts in Criminal Justice and Criminology. I have obviously a law degree, a Juris Doctorate from Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I was an assistant public defender for Baltimore City from 2001 up to 2007. And since 2007, I've been in private practice. Primarily, my primary area of practice is criminal law, and I have a license to practice law in the state of Maryland, Federal District Court, as well as the District of Columbia. And in 2007, I actually ran for a city council position in Baltimore City, and one of my main platforms as a candidate at that time was to bring in much needed services to the press areas of Baltimore City, specifically the southwest portion of Baltimore City, which is also known as the 8th District.
I'm Lauren Krasai. I'm a senior policy analyst at Justice Action Network. Justice Action Network is a national bipartisan organization working to reform the criminal justice system at the state and federal level. I've been here, I think it'll be 3 years in January, so 2.5 years. But I've been working in criminal justice reform policies since about 2012. I previously was the director of criminal justice reform at Reason Foundation, a libertarian nonprofit in DC. But at Justice Action Network, what we do is we focus on criminal justice reform policy at I work on our state team, so I work on state policy, try to get laws changed in both Republican, Democratic states, purple states, everywhere. So very excited to talk about kind of how that process works and what we're seeing in light of all of the recent protests. So thanks for having me.
And good afternoon. My name is Suhail Khan, as was already stated. I have been an attorney for about 25 years, working in various capacities, mainly in the public policy and political arena here in Washington, D.C. I'm originally from California, but I first came to Washington, D.C. to work for a congressman from my hometown in the Bay Area, who also happened to be a Stanford law professor, and so very constitutionally minded. So hit the ground running on Capitol Hill, working on issues related to criminal defense and other civil liberties issue, both on the federal level, but including on the international level as well. And then I served in the Bush administration for both terms, from 2001 to 2009 in various capacities, working in the White House, and then for 2 cabinet secretaries, working on legal, public policy, and other related issues there. And then I've been active in the criminal justice arena now for about 4 years, working with various organizations. My strength is really the coalition piece, and so working with groups like the Coalition for Public Safety, Stand Together, the ACLU, and what I really strive to do is to work in a very broad coalition. To me, politics is the art of the possible. And the possible is only, to me, in my experience, working on Capitol Hill and working in the administration, is when you bring together a coalition, hopefully a diverse coalition, which can bring center left, center right, and people right in the middle together to pass good public policy. And so I work with groups on the center right, whether they be groups, like I said, Stand Together, Americans for Tax Reform, Right on Crime, Texas Public Policy Institute, and groups on the center left, Center for American Progress, ACLU, New America Foundation, etc., on areas where we agree. So I'm really excited for the conversation this afternoon.
All righty, thank you all for introducing yourselves. So let's get right into the discussion. Let's start with implicit bias. This is a term that we've heard a lot as the Black Lives Matters movement has picked up a lot of momentum in the recent weeks, beginning with the killing of George Floyd. Implicit bias is one of the most difficult factors of racism to address because of its elusive nature. It definitely plays a role in shaping people's public perception, but oftentimes people don't realize that it also plays a role in shaping public policy as well. Can you all talk about implicit bias and how it impacts our justice system? This question is open to everybody, but I'd like to start us off with Andre.
Yes, this is something that I know all too well. I've had well over 100 jury trials, criminal jury trials. Well, let's put it this way, I stopped counting at 100, so it was way beyond that. And my jury trials have been in Baltimore City, Washington, D.C. at the Superior Court, as well as Charles County, Maryland, as well as Howard County, Maryland. So I've been all over the state and in the District of Columbia as far as jury trials. And I can tell you that it is definitely implicit bias in the criminal justice system. After conducting over 100 jury trials, and I think jury trials, like I said, could be close to 200. I stopped counting at 100. I can tell you one of the worst kept secrets is that there is racial bias in the criminal justice system. Starting from the very beginning, jury selection. Again, it's the worst kept secret. Talk to any or speak with any defense attorney, whether that defense attorney be African American, white, Asian, what have you. Speak to any criminal defense attorney, and they will tell you that when picking a jury, that many criminal, because we know that there's a bias, not just in the criminal justice system, but also there's a bias within society as a whole. So when you're picking the jury, you actually try to weed out, we call it voir dire or jury selection. And when you pick out your jury, you try to, both sides try to weed out the jurors who they think would not be good for that position. Like I said, one of the worst case secrets is that typically speaking, and there's exceptions, but typically speaking, generally speaking, most defense attorneys will try to weed out middle-aged or middle-class white jurors. And the reason why is because there is a belief that for the most part, they are going to believe all of the negative stereotypes that they see on television, movies, etc., concerning specifically African American men. That's number one. Number two, many times those same jurors will actually give the police officers, law enforcement officers, the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I've had trials in which it was clear that the officers were not telling the truth. It was almost like the officers were at the same scene, they worked the same case, but it was almost like they were in different, working different cases, because during the trial, what you do is you ask the judge to have all the witnesses get out the courtroom or stay outside of the courtroom while the other witnesses are speaking. And this is also for police officers. And you would have one officer that would have one story, and his partner will have a totally different story. Because here's a fundamental truth about trials, especially when you're on the spot. You can try to go over your stories as much as you can, but until you get on that witness stand and you being questioned by the attorney, it doesn't matter how much you prepare. If you're not telling the truth, it will come out usually. And I've had cases in which 2-3 officers had 2 or 3 different stories. And depending where I'm at, depending which jurisdiction I'm in, for example, I would say like Howard County or even Washington, D.C., the jurors will still get the officers of the benefit of the doubt. And after the trial, when you speak to the jurors, I've gotten comments such as, well, the police, they're out here risking their lives, and I thank them for their service, and they have too much stress. And plus, your client, I don't think he was telling the truth. And then I've gotten that more than once. And I would ask the jurors, well, my client didn't testify. So, I mean, what do you mean he wasn't telling the truth? He wasn't testifying, and the judge actually gave you instructions not to even consider the fact that he remained silent at trial, because this is right. But I just throw that out there because there's definitely implicit bias, definitely within the, like I said, within the criminal justice system. And a lot of that is from society as a whole, independent of the criminal justice system. But I can also tell you, and I'll try to wrap it up as quickly as I can. One story that I can recall, I was in a county in Maryland. Matter of fact, it was Howard County, Maryland. I had 2 clients. One was white, one was an African-American woman. Both of them were drug addicts. Both of them, I mean, it was clear that they were both on drugs. The white defendant, the offer or the offer that was given by the state was a period of suspended sentence, but he would serve 18 months. And the reason given for that, generous deal, was because he was a drug addict. Now, he was charged, he had 2 cases in Howard County, one being theft up to $100,000, and he had another case in Carroll County, Maryland. But the state's attorney knew at the time, or they believed that he was on drugs, so they wanted him to get help, so they only wanted him to do 18 months in jail. Now, fast forward that to a month later, I had an African-American client, female, and same thing, but this was it wasn't a theft case, it was a drug case, but everyone knew that she was, again, an addict and needed help. In fact, a couple of times in court, she was actually high in court. That's how, I mean, she was an addict for over 20 years. And the state's attorney's office, not the same prosecutor, but the same officer, for her deal was a 20-year sentence, suspend all but 6 years, even though these are both addicts. And for my white client, they said, well, he needs to get help, he needs to get treatment. For the African-American female, it was more a punishment. And I actually put that on the record when it was time for sentencing, that I don't understand why the female got a sentence of 6 years of active incarceration, but my client, who was a white male, got an active incarceration of 18 months. And I don't think that's done purposely. I think it may be a subconscious thing, but those are examples. I can give a whole bunch of examples, but those are the 2 examples that I can give that from my personal experience of the bias, implicit bias within the criminal justice system.
All right, Lauren or Sahel, do you guys have anything to add to the implicit bias piece? because Andre highlighted, please carry on.
Oh, that's right. I was just going to say, I would give a much more stark example, and that is, when it comes to federal sentencing guidelines, and this is where there would be a bias that would have a disparate impact upon various community groups, was when it comes to cocaine sentencing. So and this is pretty well known, particularly in the 80s and 90s when we had the crack epidemic, the sentencing guidelines for those that were convicted of possession or in dealing of cocaine was much lower for powdered cocaine versus for crack cocaine. And when you had a higher sentence guideline for crack cocaine, that would disproportionately have a negative impact on African American and other people of color who were brought up as defendants. And so that's where you would have a bias for, as Andre articulated, virtually the same crime of possession or dealing, but the sentencing would be disparate, would have a vast difference depending on the type of cocaine that was in question. And so that would be an example that I'm aware of, that again, federal lawmakers began to realize that there was a disparity there and sought to address that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I think there's overwhelming evidence that the system is racist, and there's empirical evidence for this. I mean, I think there was a massive study that just came out in May that looked at reports of people who were pulled over just across the country. They looked at 95 million records of people who were pulled over. Overwhelmingly, people who are, if you're Black, you're more likely to get pulled over. What was interesting about this study is that they also pulled out the times that people were pulled over. So at night, there was much less of a disparity because officers couldn't see who was driving the car. But during the day, if you're Black, you're much more likely to be pulled over. If you're pulled over, you're much more likely to get searched if you're Black or a person of color. And although the study also found that if you were white, the people who were white who were pulled over actually were much more likely to have illicit substances on them. So that's just one example. I mean, there's tons of examples. Just off the top of my head, I would say, like, if you're if you're more likely to be sentenced to death row, for example, if you're a person of color and a white person who committed a similar crime, you're much more likely to get longer sentences in the justice system if you commit the exact same, which is something that Andre just spoke about. But it's all over the place, unfortunately, and I think it's something that thankfully people who are like me, who have not experienced the same things in the justice system as someone who's a person of color, although who have seen it for the years that I've been working in it, are starting to realize that this is something that impacts so many people. And it's not something that's so obvious. Like you're mentioning, a lot of it is implicit biases that you just grow up with and are proliferated throughout the system. So, but there is, and I can share, well, I guess we're on Facebook Live. I was going to say, I can put in the chat like some links to some of these studies, but yeah, if you just search, you'll find something. So.
And if I can add, that what Lauren touches upon is so important, and that is, there are no doubt that we have anecdotal evidence of discrimination and racism within the system, and that's important, obviously, because we want to point to those. But where we can address that, there has to be one data, and that's what Lauren pointed out, where you have to show studies. So it's not just, two cases where, because human error can be involved where you have, somebody having a bad day or a judge just being erratic in their decisions and their decrees, depending on the economic, standard. Of course, as Andre will attest, counsel makes a huge difference on who's representing a client, and that's why my little brother is a public defender for the last 12 years, and there can be a vast discrepancy in representation, and that's why ineffective counsel is such a big issue for those that can't afford to have the best and brightest as their attorneys. And there are very strong and zealous advocates that are public defenders, but oftentimes they're not, and so that's something that we have to be careful of. But what's so important is, again, the study and the data of these discrepancies, so that we can see patterns where there is, in fact, not just one particular judge having an erratic, judging
Yeah.
history, but that there's a
Mhm.
larger pattern of, as Lauren articulated, people being pulled over based on race, higher
Exactly.
numbers, or sentencing,
Yeah.
or people being put on death row or getting longer sentences, or juveniles being treated as adults. There's so many ways that people can be
That it
discriminated
enters.
against, and that's
Exactly.
something that we have to look at. Absolutely.
Exactly. So a lot of the implicit bias examples that you guys talked about first enters our justice system at the police level, at the local level where these crimes are first found, right? So in light of the recent executive order that Trump recently issued that deals with community policing, Sahel, can you talk about what this order is intended to achieve and how this order will specifically impact the Black community?
So the president issued an executive order last week, and many have seen this. This was an executive order. First, it must be understood that the president's powers are very limited, and since we are, again, as we've already articulated, we really need to do a systemic review and reform of not only our federal laws but also our state laws when it comes to criminal justice. So the executive order was a very modest effort within the powers of the executive branch to really bring the DOJ, which of course is part of the executive branch, to have much more oversight when it comes to law enforcement. And it was something that, it should be stated, was done with the strong input of law enforcement. It's for better or worse. And there's pluses and minuses when you have that type of agreement for this executive order. So one of the things that, for example, the executive order did is to establish a national database whereby we've heard now so much about, when there are officers who engage in inappropriate, violent, and oftentimes illegal behavior, that even if they're fired, they'll bounce to another city, county. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country, and so they'll go from one agency to another, get rehired, and keep offending. And so it gets very difficult to really weed out the bad actors in law enforcement if they're bouncing around. And so one of the major things that the executive order does is establish a database to track and to keep track and to monitor these individuals, so that once somebody does get fired, because oftentimes what happens is people are not brought up for charges, they're just let go. And so in this instance, what the executive order will do is keep track of those individuals so that other law enforcement agencies don't rehire them, so that the problem isn't just shifted from one place to another. Another thing that the executive order does is it really incentivizes federal funding, because many state and local law enforcement agencies do receive federal funding. So it incentivizes state and local law enforcement agencies to monitor, to keep track of excessive force and violence within the law enforcement agencies. So again, there's an incentive for state and local police agencies to not only monitor, but also to prevent their own officers from engaging in excessive behavior. And the third major factor is that it does provide incentive support for mental health services, both for law enforcement and for local communities. So those are the main features of the executive order.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to piggyback on that a little bit. One of the things I think that we will have to see so a lot of what's in the executive order has to be implemented by the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice has historically resisted implementing some reforms, most notably with the First Step Act, which was signed into law in 2018. They've resisted compassionate release, which is when you're elderly, and especially around COVID, there's elderly people who are medically vulnerable who have applied for compassionate release, saying like, I'm old, I only have a few months to live in some cases, like I should be released because I don't pose a threat. Technically, the DOJ is supposed to be looking for those people and releasing them, but in a lot of cases, we have just anecdotal examples where they're blocking that, and they're arguing against release of some of these folks. And so the DOJ does have to implement many aspects of this executive order. And so I do have some skepticism about that. Just wanted to add that in as just a point where, it's great that Trump recognized that he had to do something. It didn't, so many would argue it didn't really go far enough. But another caveat to that is that the DOJ is the one who's going to have to implement it. And we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, if I can add to Lauren's comment, that's why it's so crucial that we have federal legislation, because it can't be just an executive order. We need to have bipartisan, comprehensive federal legislation. And then we also need to have legislation that needs to pass in the 50 states as well. There needs to be systemic reform.
That is true. All right, moving on to our next question. One of the primary ways that people have called for action to be taken at the federal level, at the local level, is to defund the police forces. How do calls to defund the police change in light of the president's order? And is this a feasible course of action, or should we, the people, be directing our energies elsewhere? This one's for you, Lauren.
Oh, for me?
Yes.
Sure. So I would say, I think that the messaging around the defund the police, I think, needs to be a little bit clear. If you're doing I'm speaking from a perspective of like doing direct advocacy or like meeting with lawmakers in many cases who are Republicans. When they hear defund the police, I mean, some may think or believe that or advocate for it to actually like abolish the police entirely. But when they hear that, I mean, a Republican who is not super on board with reform to begin with may just not, they might just turn off. Like they're just not going to listen to you. I mean, there's certain, and I'm just speaking directly to like young people who are working towards advocacy, is just like some of the messaging that you have to use. You have to speak in like in phrases that they, I gotta choose my words carefully here. I don't mean to be like more comfortable with, but words that they're like used to hearing. You can say the same thing, but just say it in a way that they will receive it. Yeah. So for example, what I mean is like, I've worked with a lot of, in a lot of states where Republicans have rightfully realized that throwing people who have substance abuse issues in prison is not necessarily or always the best. You're not getting the best results there. And I'm arguing like as a Republican, of course, I believe that nobody should go to prison for a drug addiction issue. Now, when you say like, I think police should stop focusing so much on arresting people for drug abuse issues, and instead we should be putting more money into treatment and making sure that these people can get access to healthcare and treatment and mental health services, they, for the most part, agree with that. When we poll on those issues, like we get, I would say between 80 and 90% of respondents, Republicans, Democrats, everyone, who say that more money needs to be spent on treatment and mental health services. Now, for a lot of people who are advocating for defunding the police, that's exactly what they're advocating for, is that we need to stop using police to respond to some of these issues. We need to have better healthcare. We need to have better access to mental health services. But when a Republican hears defund the police, they might not hear that, even though they ultimately agree with some of the underlying concerns. And so I would just say for young people who are advocating for this stuff, just know who your audience is and try to reframe your talking points so that they are actually received by the person who's in power, who has the ultimate ability to do something about that. So.
Alrighty. So we recently witnessed a delayed response in the arrest of the murders of both George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. We can all agree that justice delayed is justice denied. The responsible criminals seem to be protected or have some sort of immunity under the law. Why is that, and does it have something to do with the officer's relationship with people in power, such as the district attorney's office, the prosecutors, and or the judges? This one's for you, Andre.
I'll say this, and I'm just again going based on my own personal experiences and personal observations. Again, this is another one of those what I call worst kept secrets in the criminal justice system. It's no question that the state's attorney, well, in Maryland we call it the state's attorney's office, but I know in other areas they call it district attorney, but it's the same thing. The prosecutor, whoever, whether it's a federal prosecutor, state's prosecutor. But like I said, it's one of the worst kept secrets, and that is that there is a professional and non-professional relationship oftentimes between the frontline prosecutors as well as the deputy and also the actual prosecutor themselves and law enforcement. I remember when I first became an attorney, around the courthouse in downtown Baltimore, they had different pubs and bars and things of that nature. And although I don't drink, I would sometimes be invited to the happy hour just to, I guess, to rub elbows and to politic with some of the supervisors. And when you go in these areas in the corner, you would see quite often a group of prosecutors and a group of off-duty police officers having beers and talking about their case and things of that nature. So yes, there's a relationship. And so now when there are allegations of an officer doing committing a crime or murder or what have you, or misconduct, it may be difficult. I'm trying to put myself in the position of a prosecutor that, hey, just a week or two ago, I was at a happy hour where we were playing softball with this guy. Now I'm looking at his case, trying to determine whether or not he has to be prosecuted. And I'm not saying that happens all of the time, but if you think about it, in the criminal justice system, the police officer, they're the first, if you want to call it the frontline soldiers or whatever, but they're the ones who make the arrest, who find probable cause. And it's then the prosecutor then have to look at what the officer did and make a determination whether or not official charges should be filed, whether or not they should go to court. Once that determination is made, then you can imagine that the prosecutor and the officer are communicating, they're talking after hours, during the weekend, trying to prosecute a case. Now multiply that times 100 or 1,000, like in the city of Baltimore or Washington, Philadelphia, and then multiply that times a number of years. So yeah, so when I first heard of the case in Georgia, that's not in which the father and the son chased the guy down in
the Ahmed Arbery case.
From reading that, if you read that, there were not one, not two, but three district attorneys who saw the case. Now they saw the same video that we saw and the same information they had before. Three separate district attorneys saw that video, and each of them said that the police officers acted appropriately, but they were going to accuse themselves, and it was almost like hot potato. And in the sense that they said, well, the officers acted well, but I'm not going to touch this case. I'm going to give it to somebody else, recuse myself, because I know the gentleman because he used to be a police officer. And that happened 3 times. It wasn't until this story made national news and started gaining national attention that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation got involved, and that independently, they were the ones who actually filed charges. But just think about that. The same video that everybody else saw of a man jogging and someone chasing him in a Jeep. In fact, there were two Jeeps. One Jeep actually cut the victim off, and then the son jumped out of the Jeep and wrestled him with the gun. And we all saw the video. It was a tragic video. But we all saw that. And however, 3 experienced prosecutors in that area refused to actually take this to court. And we saw the same thing in Tavon Martin, truth be told, in Florida. Even though Zimmerman wasn't a police officer, he was someone who was known to the police because he was a block watch captain, and he worked with the police a lot. Same thing, you come to think about it as a police officer. In both cases, you come to a scene. One guy's dead, another guy has a weapon, and that guy, I'm just trying to figure out how that conversation might have taken place. They say, okay, what happened here? Well, he tried to fight and we had to shoot him. Okay, well, we take your word for it. We're not pressing any charges. That would never happen if that was an African-American male and if it was reversed. Imagine the scene if the police came to a scene, an African-American male had a shotgun and laying bleeding was either a 17-year-old white boy or a white male. This never would happen. And I don't think anybody would disagree to that. But to your question, yeah, that is an issue. And that's an issue that seem like when these events come up, it always pops up, and that is the relationship between the prosecutors and the police force, which makes it it makes it difficult in many cases for them to press charges and go forward with it. And we saw the same thing in the Michael Brown case in St. Louis. I mean, I can talk about that for the next 10, 15 minutes, but the same thing with that. The prosecutor in that case, and I'm speaking as an experienced defense attorney, the prosecutor in that case did it. He got out of it in what I would call a cowardly way.
Exactly.
In a cowardly way.
That buddy system, many believe, is defended by something that is known as qualified immunity. Lauren, can you explain to us how exactly qualified immunity works? And is it a roadblock to justice or a shield for law enforcement? Are criminal laws applied differently by race in this country?
So qualified immunity, I mean, Suhail can also jump in here because this is something that's been talked about at the federal level, but basically it's essentially a doctrine that was just made up by the courts that protects law enforcement and other federal actors, so corrections officers and others. Basically says if there isn't, so say like something happens and there's like misconduct allegations, or someone is shot by police, or police, let's take a very common example that happens all the time: police shoots and kills your dog. So say that happens and you try to file a complaint or whatever, there's a case, and if a court hasn't previously ruled on a case or ruled that qualified immunity does not apply to this person previously, then it protects the law enforcement. So it's really like this, it's very hard basically to hold people accountable, because if there's no prior case, which how can you bring a prior case if it makes no sense. It basically just protects bad actors, and I feel like I didn't do as good of a job explaining that as perhaps Andre or Suhail could. But it's very complicated, and it's really dumb, and it basically protects bad actors. It prohibits you from ever being held accountable if you do something wrong as law enforcement, if you can just always claim qualified immunity. So I'm going to let the legal experts maybe take it from here. I'm the non-lawyer on the call.
All right, Andre, Suhail, do any of you have any other ways of explaining exactly what qualified immunity is?
No, I think Lauren touched upon it, and I'm sure Andre has some experience with it in the courtroom. But that is something that you're hearing about right now. It's something that's right now being considered in Congress. Essentially, as Lauren articulated, it basically is a shield for law enforcement from individual citizens from effectively lodging a complaint for any type of misconduct by a law enforcement agent. And it basically, as the name itself denotes, it shields a law enforcement agent, an officer, from liability, from any wrongdoing. And the standard has to be very high to show wrongdoing on the part of a law enforcement officer in order to pierce that immunity. And so both Republicans and Democrats have been examining this issue. The Democratic bill that passed in the House yesterday completely eliminates qualified immunity. The bill that was introduced by the Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina in the Senate, which unfortunately was blocked by the majority of the Democrats for even discussion and consideration in the Senate on Tuesday, does not directly address qualified immunity, but there are several lawmakers on both sides of the aisle that want to address that issue. And so there's no doubt that this will be an issue that will be considered on the federal side. And just to state the obvious, of course, the law enforcement defense of qualified immunity is that you can't not have it, because otherwise police officers will not do anything in the field because they'll be afraid of getting sued. And so we do live in a very litigious society. And so there are, my sense of it, just this is me personally speaking, is that I wouldn't want to go as far as eliminating it. But on the other hand, I do think there's need for reform, and I think there is bipartisan agreement that there needs to be some modification and perhaps a lowering of the standard of protection for law enforcement officers, that when they do engage in wrongdoing against citizens, that the bar to bring them to justice not be as high as it currently is.
And I'm just piggyback what you said also, just looking at this from a real life perspective. As we all know, in 2015, there were the riots in Baltimore as a result of the death of Freddie Gray. And pretty quickly after the riot, in fact, during the riots, the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby of Baltimore, had announced that 6 officers were going to be prosecuted for the death of Freddie Gray. Now, as we all know, 3 of the officers were acquitted, and then after that, the state's attorney just dismissed the other 3 cases. Here's the problem, and again, I'm not a proponent for qualified immunity either. However, what I've personally seen in Baltimore is this: after those officers were indicted, Freddie Gray, you have and this is what actually happens in real time. And not too many cities have had the experience as Baltimore has had. And that is, after those officers were prosecuted, you had officers on the field, some that I know personally, who essentially said, okay, we were doing our jobs. We were called to this area in West Baltimore, which had a above average as far as shootings and killings. We were even requested to go there by the state's attorney's office before Freddie Gray. Now these officers are being prosecuted. And what I was hearing from officers off the record were, you know what, from this point forward, Mr. Khan, you actually brought this up too, as far as what officers think is what the officers believe. And I've actually seen this. And what the officers would say was, you know what, we're only responding to 911 calls. We're not doing anything proactive anymore. We're not going to do anything extra. We're going to do our job, but we're going to do the bare minimum. And some, and again, this is up for debate, some have argued this is no argument, this is fact, since the Freddie Gray incident in the prosecution, Baltimore, we've had over 300 homicides a year since 2015. In fact, I believe we had 340 last year. And that's extraordinary for a city of just 600,000 people. In fact, I believe Newsweek had called Baltimore the most dangerous city in the country. So that's an issue that you have. I'm just saying, being more practical. I understand that qualified immunity some might look at that as giving the officers a blank check to do whatever they want. And in fact, that may be the case. I've witnessed that also. But the problem is that when we do prosecute officers, and this is something that might have to be done legislatively or through training, what have you. But I've personally seen officers essentially, to use a football metaphor, take a knee. I mean, they will respond to a shooting after, but they're not going to do anything to try to prevent it. And some would argue, and I'm not here to debate that, but some would argue by doing that, then you actually run the risk of a higher than normal crime rate. And I can just look at Baltimore, my city, and like I said, we've averaged 340 homicides for 4 years straight. And this year, even during the pandemic, when we were all locked in, we are actually at, or I think a little bit above the numbers that we had last year. And that's what we're locked in. So that's an issue that's going to come up politically. And I know that people who advocate or who are opponents of getting rid of immunity for officers, they would point to examples like that. And
exactly.
Have to be
discussed. I just want to jump in on one clarifying point. I'm sorry. I just want to say that I should have said this up top, but qualified immunity only applies to civil liability, not criminal liability. So like, if a cop is found, criminal charges are brought against the cop, that has nothing to do with the civil liability that qualified immunity protects. So qualified immunity does not protect officers from being criminally charged with something if they break the law.
That's right. That's correct.
All right. That makes sense. Thank you all for clarifying. That takes us into our next question because all three of you mentioned something along the lines of political parties. And we all know political parties play a large role in the justice system today and often influence the way racial justice is carried out across the country. So this one's for you, Sahel. You've worked with the RNC for a long time, and many Americans believe that the Republican Party harbors many racist attitudes. Are there any actions that are being taken to prevent such attitudes from tainting the political process?
So that's a great question. First, just to put a bow, as it were, on the last question, as Lauren articulated, so the qualified immunity only goes to civil. So that's, again, if somebody were wrongfully murdered by a police officer, then the family cannot sue the police officer for damages. On the criminal side, there is legislation that would reduce the mens rea requirement, or the intent of the police officer from willful. Right now, the current standard is willful, and it would lower it to knowingly or with reckless disregard. And so that would make it easier to press charges in a criminal context against an officer who has engaged in, say, a wrongful death, just to make that clear. To answer your question, look, I'm a lifelong conservative Republican. I think there's a lot of myth out there. I mean, my party was founded on freeing the slaves. President Lincoln was the first Republican president. We were strong advocates for the civil rights movement. Everett Dirksen, who was the majority leader, Republican from Illinois, was the one who got that passed so that LBJ could sign the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act. And so I'm very proud of the record that the GOP has had when it comes to issues related to civil rights and civil liberties. But there's no doubt that in today's world, there are many, I would argue in both parties, because to me, it's much more generational in their approaches to justice issues and the criminal issues. You're seeing now presidential candidate Joe Biden is getting pretty tough criticism for his support of the crime bill in the 90s, back when both Democrats and Republicans in the 90s were pushing for get tougher on crime laws. And what I will say is that right now we're seeing a lot of the cutting edge of reforms when it comes to criminal justice being implemented first in red states. Then Governor Perry in Texas was the first to tackle criminal justice reform in the state of Texas, which of course had a very well-known, notorious record for being tough on criminal defendants. In Kentucky, Governor Matt Bevin was somebody who was able to implement, as a Republican, reforms in Kentucky. And I would say it's for a couple reasons. I don't want to, try to take too much credit here on the party. I think it's partially because, as Andre articulated, yes, most Americans recognize that there are needs for reform, and there are needs to really look at not only racial, but also economic inequalities in our criminal justice system, but also people, I live in Washington, D.C., I've had a gun put in my face. And so you also want the bad guys to be put away. And as Andre articulated, you want to be able to call the police when you need them, and you hope that they will be there to protect and to serve. And so most Americans, I think, are in the middle. They want reforms, but they also want to have some sense that the law enforcement agencies will function as needed, and that we recognize that the vast majority of law enforcement officers are out there trying to do the best they can to protect our fellow citizens. And so that's why oftentimes it takes somebody who has the reputation for being a little more friendly to law enforcement agencies, which is usually the Republican Party, to be the one to say, hey, as much as I am a friend of law enforcement, I also recognize that there are disparities. And so they have a little more credibility, as Lauren articulated, to really make those changes, and to convince otherwise, a little more old school and old fashioned lawmakers to take the plunge to enact reforms. And you just saw that on the federal level, right? For 8 years, President Obama was talking about criminal justice reform, but it got nowhere. Within 2 years of President Trump being in office, with his record, very much in question, we were able to get on a very bipartisan level, and it took Democrats and Republicans working together in the House and Senate to get the First Step Act. It was, again, a first step. And I'm convinced if we can come together and in a bipartisan fashion, we can get legislation that'll be much more comprehensive through. And President Trump has already indicated that he will sign a bill. He's already said that he will sign the GOP bill that Senator Tim Scott has introduced. And so I'm hopeful that the House and Senate Republicans and Democrats and the handful of libertarians that we have working together can get something done.
Great. All right. So Lauren, do you have anything to add in terms of the bipartisan consensus when it comes to criminal justice reform? Are there any reforms taking place on that front, bipartisan wise? Hello?
Did we lose Lauren?
Lauren?
No, sorry. I accidentally hit mute. I was
Okay.
I'm like not tech savvy. I'm sorry. Anyway, yes. As Suhail mentioned, there are a number of states that have enacted criminal justice reforms in the last 10 years that have been Republican, but those reforms have been passed in a bipartisan way. And so, which is very interesting to see, because I think that unusually, like, criminal justice reform is actually maybe one of the only issue that has still some bipartisan support. Now, as far as like how far people want to go, I think that there's still some like disagreement there. But overall, when we poll on these issues in states, like I mentioned before, Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly support the idea of reform, sending fewer people to prison for nonviolent offenses, for example, increasing access to treatment, mental health services. A lot of people are in favor of bail reform. When you explain what that is, they're in favor of civil asset forfeiture reform, which, just to quickly explain for people who don't know, civil asset forfeiture means that if you're pulled over by police and police merely suspect that a crime has been committed, they can steal your car, they can steal any cash that you have in your car. And I use the word steal because I really, I mean, it is basically legalized theft. And they can forfeit it and they can keep it, and they don't have to ever charge you or convict you of a crime. This is still common practice in a number of states, but this is one issue, weirdly, that Republicans have really gotten behind in recent years. Like, we had a bill in Arizona that was sponsored by very tough on crime senator who was, for all intents and purposes, very anti-criminal justice reform. I mentioned that some Republicans are mostly in favor. He was not, but he sponsored a very robust civil asset forfeiture bill that would have required a conviction before you could keep people's property. So only the proceeds of the crime would be kept. So there's a number of different issues that I do think have bipartisan support. They might be lower hanging fruit for a lot of people who are more invested in systemic and transformational change. But I like to kind of just remember that it took a really long time to build the system up to where it is today, and it might take time to kind of scale it back to where we would like to see it. And I wouldn't say that because we aren't making great leaps forward in a lot of places doesn't mean that we're going to see change still happening. So it is very interesting to work in space for that reason.
All right. So as we prepare to move on to our next couple questions, we have a couple minutes left. So I encourage our panelists to keep the answers short and sweet, because we have a lot of questions that we have to get through, because people want to know, people want to know. So that'll take us right into our next question. This one is for you, Suhail. Voting is key in moving our political process forward. How can we take the Black Lives Matter polls to, how can we take Black Lives Matter to the polls? And me, my friends, my peers, many of us will be going to the polls for the first time come November. So how can we advocate for the movement as we exercise our political right to vote?
Well, this is something I'm very passionate about. I've been involved in campaigns for nearly 30 years, both on the state and federal level, and it's given me an opportunity to work on campaigns all over the country, for that matter. And I think that that is exactly right. People need to be involved, and it's not just a matter of voting. That's kind of the minimum, is registering, to vote and then actually, in fact, going and voting, but really being an informed voter. You know, I'm a big consumer of media, but you know, I'm also one of the biggest critics of media, because oftentimes, whether you're watching, you know, certain right-leaning media or certain left-leaning media, you're kind of being fed a line, and you know, I don't like to be played any more than anybody else does. And so I think it's very important that we as citizens get involved, register to vote, but before casting that vote, learn about the candidates, learn about the issues, and actually really question those candidates on those issues, whether in person at town hall meetings or at events or online. You know, now we're able to go online and to really research the candidates, their positions on given issues. And I will say, just as we talked about the media, not to take perhaps the candidates' party affiliation or their race, you know, for granted, to assume that they agree with us, you know, agree with you just because they might be of a party or a race or a gender that we might feel more comfortable with, but really to dive down. Because what I find, particularly on these issues related to criminal justice and real reform, is that it's much more generational. It's much more about people, I would argue, that are a little more thoughtful, that oftentimes is people that are willing to take risks. And, you know, there are people that when they're informed by the facts, as Lauren articulated, on a particular issue, they can change, but it takes citizens in getting engaged in that and really holding our politicians' feet to the fire.
All right, as we prepare to wrap up our conversation, I have one final question. The Young Leaders Institute is a national platform for young people that promotes youth engagement in all areas of civic life. In the light of the recent Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of my peers, a lot of young people have taken the platform to social media, reaching out to their local leaders, advocating for these on all levels of government. So I ask all three of you, what is the most important thing that young people can do to ensure that our system has fewer bad actors? I'd also like to ask that each of you leave us with one tangible thing that we can do to ensure that the justice system we have in place tomorrow is better than the one we have today.
I can go first. It kind of ties to your last question, which is related to voting. I would say what young people can do is, first of all, make sure they're registered to vote, but also look up who your county attorney is or your district attorney. Prosecutors in this country wield enormous power. They have enormous discretion to charge people, and ultimately that's the sentence that they will probably end up receiving. So if they're being charged with like harsher punishments or harsher crimes, they're going to get a longer sentence, and that's totally up to the prosecutor what people are going to be charged with. And so if you Google to see if your county attorney is up for election, and then do some more Googling and see if they have a record of being really tough on crime and advocating for really harsh punishments for all sorts of people, Black and brown people, whatever. I mean, the news stories are out there if you just Google for it. Google for it? Do I sound so old right now? Oh my God. But anyway, if you Google it, you will find their record online. And if their opponent is someone who's advocating for reform or just right-sizing the system, there's a lot of people who are running as district attorneys on reform campaigns. And I think that that's probably the number one thing that people can do right now, is just educate themselves on their district attorney, find out if there's a reform candidate running against them, and make sure that they educate themselves on those issues. You can vote these people out.
If I can. Please.
The question was what young people can do. One advice I will give to young voters is to follow up. Earlier this year, looking at all the polls, I'm just looking at the Democratic primaries. If you looked at all of the polls, Bernie Sanders was leading, because a lot of the polls were polling younger people, and Bernie Sanders actually went for the younger vote. I think he even had Cardi B at a couple of his rallies and things of that nature. But unfortunately, the younger voters, and this is not just this election, this is, and like I said, if you're talking to someone who actually ran for a city council position in Baltimore in 2007, the problem is that that energy doesn't always translate to votes, because a lot of times, and here's a reputation that young people have, is that they don't follow through and vote. And you saw that with Bernie Sanders, even though he was a lot of the things that the young people and the Black Lives Matters were advocating, he was actually advocating for. Unfortunately, a lot of the older middle class voters voted for who? Joe Biden, who one of the people who voted for the crime bill in 1992. And so that would be one advice I would give to young people, that all this activism and energy is fine, but if you don't follow up with that, yeah, like I said, if you don't follow up with that, then unfortunately, I mean, you're going to sell yourself short. And that's the advice I would give to young people: follow up, vote, but not only vote, follow that up also by keeping those politicians' feet to the fire once they're in office, because a lot of times people feel, well, okay, I did my civic duty, I voted, and that's it, and then they just disappear until 4 years later for another and 4 years later to the next election. So keep their feet to the fire, and then that's the advice I would give to young people.
I'll just close. I agree with everything that's been said by both Andre and Lauren. Besides voting, what I would recommend, just speaking from personal experience, and that is, take that energy that we have and go volunteer for a candidate. If you find a candidate that you believe in, get out there, whether it's just a couple hours a week or maybe even more than that, volunteer for them. Win or lose, it'll be a winning experience, and you'll learn the system, and maybe you might even decide to run yourself. The system is only as good as good people getting involved, making their voices heard, and in many cases running for office themselves. And the advice that Lauren gave on DAs hits right home. My little brother, as I said, is a public defender in Santa Clara County in California, and he did raise questions about his local DA and whether he was reform-minded, and that DA tried to come down on him hard with a misguided, to say the least, whistleblower complaint. And my little brother's case received national news, and it's really been a proud moment for our family and for those who really care for reform and justice, that you can shake up the system. It just takes good people getting engaged and getting involved.
All right, thank you all so much. Now we will spend the next couple of minutes taking questions from the audience. Remember, you can drop them down in the chat box. So let's get started. Our first question is, how does voter suppression and redlining affect or impact the Black community?
Suhail, if you want to jump in, you can.
No, go ahead.
I don't know that much, so I'm not an expert on voter suppression. I will say that one thing that is very interesting in a lot of states is that they count the prison that people are housed in as part of that population when they're determining the different districts. So the people who are actually incarcerated are counted as like part of the population for terms of like districting, but they're not allowed to vote. So that's always struck me as a little outrageous. But the fact that they were able to count them as actual residents of that area, despite the fact that they're in prison, they can't vote. One of the things that is really interesting to me, and it's something that we don't work on at Jan, just because there's so many issues to work on, but is the fact that when you have a felony record in a lot of states, that prohibits you from voting. And so there's a lot of states that it's an automatic bar, sometimes a lifetime bar, from ever voting ever again if you just have one felony. And obviously, as we've mentioned, this entire conversation has been around how the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts people of color, obviously that leaves a lot of people of color who are disenfranchised and who are not able to engage in their political process. And so there are some states that have reforms that have allowed people with felony records to vote. In Florida recently, although that's kind of a mess right now, they're still working out who this applies to and all these exceptions and things like that. But it is something that I think even a lot of Republicans will agree with you that there's no public safety reason why someone should be prohibited from voting for the rest of their lives after they've served their time. I mean, there's Republicans who are in favor of expungement, aka like cleaning your record once you've served your time and you're back on your feet looking for employment. Why would you be barred from voting for the rest of your life? I mean, there's just no defense of that. So I know that doesn't really answer the question, but those are two issues that I've found really interesting when it comes to voting and disenfranchisement.
So I'll add to that. Voter suppression and redlining are two, very broad kind of concepts, and they mean different things to different people. Historically, voter suppression were efforts to try to prevent people who rightfully have the right to vote from voting. So, during the time of segregation, you had poll taxes, you had literacy tests, you had ridiculous tests where you had to count the number of, eggs in a jar, and really stupid and silly and hateful things that some implemented to try and keep, in this case, African Americans from voting and exercising their franchise. In the modern day, when we talk about voter suppression, sometimes that could mean, limiting the time for people to be able to go and vote. Of course, we vote in person on a Tuesday, so that is a work day. Now you're seeing, of course, more and more people are voting by mail, so they don't have to necessarily go to the polls. There are accusations of closing polling places in certain neighborhoods, thereby making it more difficult for certain voters to have to travel to vote. So these are some of the efforts that are currently involved that can have a disparate impact on communities. And I think, again, our elections are managed by the states and by the localities. And so that's something that, again, that's why it's so important to, really keep an eye on and be involved on the state and local level. And on the other hand, we also have to be careful that we have what they call voter integrity. That, I have worked on campaigns where there have been attempts to steal votes. There has been voter fraud. This is not a partisan issue. I worked on races in Louisiana. Louisiana's unofficial motto, and I'm going to upset my friends from Louisiana, is, we don't tolerate corruption, we celebrate it. And that's not a partisan thing. And that's where, again, in order to keep our franchise that each of us treasure so much, and many Americans have fought for so dearly, to keep that franchise and to protect it, we have to make sure that our vote is not infringed or in any way, messed with. And of course, we saw in the last election that we have foreign actors. There are several hostile governments out there that are trying to manipulate our elections as well, particularly when it comes to social media and other types of nefarious activity. And so we have to be careful about that type of activity as well. Redlining is completely different. I don't want to get too long, but redlining has to do with economic impacts for communities, whereby particularly banks will redline, literally with a red pen, certain neighborhoods to say, we're not going to offer business loans or home loans for individuals living in a particular neighborhood that they've drawn a red line around. And that's something that, again, we need to address because it is discriminatory, but it's more on economic impacts in a given neighborhood or community.
Yeah, and now I'm just going to piggyback, and I won't be long because I know we're running out of time. But obviously, voter suppression has been a long history in this country as far as suppressing the vote, specifically African Americans.
Right.
In modern times, contemporaneously, many people believe that there are certain laws, such as requiring ID and things of that nature, as a form of voter suppression. That's debated. That can be debated, I understand.
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of people, a lot of agencies, for example, NAACP and other organizations do believe that they disproportionately target African Americans. How that translates into votes or lack thereof, that's a whole nother issue. I think early this year there was some issues in some primaries in which in certain communities and neighborhoods that the machines were broken and people were turned away even though they were waiting in line for hours and hours and hours and they wasn't able to vote. Many people believe that was done on purpose. Some just say just coincidental, but some people believe that's an example of voter suppression. Now, as far as redlining is concerned and how redlining is used to perpetuate a systematic racism, a lot of people don't know the term redlining actually started in Baltimore City, I believe in the 1920s. And I didn't know that either until I looked at this documentary on PBS, but Baltimore City was the first city that had redlining, and just as Mr. Khan stated, pretty much it deals with economics such as loans, getting investments in certain areas. I personally like to extend that to even education in schools, because I can go into some of the areas of Baltimore City public schools in areas that are predominantly African American. You can just look at the test scores, and it's not just Baltimore. I can go to Prince George's County, which is also heavily populated by African American, and I don't think that's a coincidence that both of the jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, that is Baltimore City and Prince George's County, both of which have the highest percentage of African Americans. I don't think it's coincidental that both of those counties have consistently had the lowest test scores for aptitude tests and things of that nature. But how does it work for perpetuate systematic racism? Well, first of all, if there's no investment in these communities, then you're going to have economic depression in those communities. And we all know that economic depression eventually will lead to crime. And so since we are talking about criminal reform and criminal issues and crime, there is definitely a correlation between lack of economic opportunity, poor education, and crime. I can tell you if anybody ever have and I'm gonna try to quick finish this up, but if anybody has the chance to go into any courtroom or come to Baltimore, and when a defendant pleads guilty, usually when that defendant pleads guilty, the judge would ask, well, tell me a little bit about your client. I can tell you from my experience, almost 20 years, that, and this is conservatively speaking, at least 75% of those defendants didn't make it past the 11th grade. So I don't think there's and then of course, if we have more crime, you're always going to have more interaction with the police, and then you're going to have incidents that occur, unfortunate incidents that occur. So in my opinion, that's how redlining perpetuates systematic racism and also fuels the criminal justice system. I mean, if there's no economic opportunity, then you're going to have crime. And it's not just an African-American issue. You can look historically when the first immigrants from Europe, Eastern Europe, came to America, whether they're Italian or Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. You notice when they first came to New York and cities of Baltimore and Philadelphia, they had very limited opportunity. And then what you had then? You had gangsters. I mean, you had Al Capone and mafia and things of that nature. The only difference is one would argue that those groups had an opportunity based on their skin color as a way to advance and get out of the economic conditions. Whereas in Baltimore, those same areas that were redlined in 1930 are the same areas that are depressed, the same exact areas, same exact neighborhoods that are depressed in 2020 in Baltimore.
Wow. Thank you all for your insight today. So this concludes our webinar. I'd like to thank Sahel, Lauren, and Andre for their contributions to our Part 2 special editions of the youth conference titled, When Will Black Lives Matter? Our next webinar will be in July about why self-care is more important than ever during a pandemic. To stay informed about our future programming, we'd like to invite you to stay connected and follow us on social media via our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter pages, or you can visit us at our website, www.youngleadersinstitute.org. I'm Chidamma Ndubisi Olavu. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you next.